An emotional outburst today in the Michael Jackson wrongful death trial. A nurse practitioner broke down and sobbed as she testified at the end of today's proceeding.
Michael Jackson.
He looked at me and said the pain was unbearable. And 2 months later, he was dead. And the woman he said it to sat in a courtroom decades afterward and could barely get the words out. That single sentence sits at the center of one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern entertainment history. Because it wasn't a stranger who watched Michael Jackson fall apart in his final weeks. It was his nurse, his children, his mother, his siblings, the paramedics who found him, the doctor who was supposed to save him, and dozens of witnesses who each held one piece of a puzzle that, when placed together, tells a story far more disturbing than anyone expected walking into a Los Angeles courtroom in the fall of 2011. Sherilyn Lee, a nurse practitioner who had been treating Jackson with natural remedies for his sleep problems, testified that Jackson grew increasingly desperate for a drug called Diprivan, more widely known by its generic name, propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic never intended for use outside a hospital operating room. She told the court he described it as the only thing that could put him to sleep instantly, and that he had grown so fixated on it that he began asking around, doctor to doctor, for anyone willing to give it to him. Lee refused. She told him plainly that no one who genuinely cared about him would ever hand him that drug to use as a sleep aid, warning him that he could go to sleep and simply never wake up. It's an eerie thing to hear now, because that's almost exactly what happened. What most people don't realize is that Lee wasn't the only medical professional who turned him down. A dental anesthesiologist who had given him propofol before, strictly for procedures, testified that when Jackson later asked for it to treat insomnia, she refused outright, telling him it was never meant for that purpose. Multiple doctors said no. Multiple nurses said no. And that raises the uncomfortable question that hovers over this entire case. If almost every trained medical professional around Michael Jackson recognized the danger and walked away, why did one man not only agree, but move into his mansion and start giving it to him nearly every single night? That man was Dr. Conrad Murray. And the answer investigators eventually uncovered wasn't complicated so much as it was chilling in its simplicity. Murray had been brought on as Jackson's personal physician for an extraordinary monthly sum, reportedly around $150,000, funded not by Jackson personally, but by AEG Live, the concert promotion company staging his planned comeback shows in London. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it meant Murray's paycheck was tied not to Jackson's long-term health, but to Jackson's ability to show up and perform. Investigators later discovered that Murray was, at the time, drowning in his own financial crisis, facing foreclosure on his home, and owing well over $1 million in debts, including back child support. A detective who testified in the related civil trial laid out those numbers in stark detail, and the implication was hard to ignore. A man in that kind of financial hole, suddenly handed a six-figure monthly salary contingent on keeping one man functional and on schedule, had every incentive in the world to say yes to whatever that man asked for, and very little incentive to say no. Night after night, in a bedroom with no hospital monitoring equipment, no oxygen backup, and no second physician present, Murray set up an 4-drip of propofol to knock Jackson unconscious so he could sleep. Anesthesiology experts, who later reviewed the case, didn't mince words. They described what Murray was doing as a fundamental violation of nearly every basic safety principle in his field, the kind of medical abandonment that simply should never happen. Administering a surgical-grade anesthetic in a home bedroom with none of the safeguards that exist specifically because this drug can stop a person's breathing without warning. Records would later show that Murray never actually purchased the propofol under his own name. Instead, it was routed through his Las Vegas office and shipped, again and again, in increasing quantities, to the Santa Monica apartment of his girlfriend at the time, a woman named Nicole Alvarez, who had no medical role in Jackson's care whatsoever. That detail alone told investigators something important, because there's no legitimate medical reason to funnel a controlled surgical anesthetic through your girlfriend's apartment instead of your own office. It suggested, from the very beginning, a level of concealment that went far beyond ordinary carelessness. What makes this section of the story so unsettling isn't just the medical failure. It's what happened in the minutes and hours immediately afterward, because according to testimony, instead of a clear picture of a doctor desperately trying to save his patient. Witnesses described something closer to chaos, concealment, and calculated self-preservation. A member of Jackson's household staff who was first to reach the bedroom said Murray was already scrambling to gather 4 bags, vials, and medical debris into bags, seemingly clearing evidence, before anyone had even called for paramedics. That witness, Alberto Alvarez, Jackson's head of logistics, would become one of the most scrutinized figures in the entire trial, in part because his initial statements to detectives never mentioned any of this. It wasn't until months later, after the coroner publicly released the actual cause of death, that Alvarez suddenly recalled putting a vial into an 4 bag at Murray's instruction. A shift in his story that defense attorneys seized on relentlessly, arguing it looked less like a memory returning, and more like a story being adjusted to fit the facts everyone now knew. Whatever the truth of that particular detail, the broader timeline was damning regardless. 2 paramedics who arrived on scene separately testified that Jackson's body already showed unmistakable signs that a significant amount of time had passed since his heart had stopped, physical signs that directly contradicted Murray's claim that Jackson had only just collapsed. One of those paramedics later told the court he watched Murray gather vials of a completely different drug, lidocaine, from the floor and place them into a bag before leaving the house, an act that one witness suggested looked less like panic and more like an attempt to control what investigators would eventually find. And in the middle of all of it, according to Jackson's aide Michael Amir Williams, Murray placed a frantic 35-second phone call telling him Jackson had suffered a bad reaction and that someone needed to come immediately. But Williams testified that in that call, Murray never once said the words, "Call 911. It was Williams and the rest of the household who made that decision on their own. Even more strangely, once they were already at the hospital watching doctors fight for Jackson's life, Williams said Murray pulled him aside and repeatedly asked whether someone could go back to the house and remove a cream from Jackson's bedroom, something Murray reportedly said Jackson wouldn't want the world to know about. In the middle of the worst moment of his professional life, with his patient possibly dying feet away, Murray's mind was apparently already on damage control. The emergency room itself became its own battlefield of deception. When Jackson arrived at UCLA Medical Center, the physician who received him testified that by the time he reached the hospital, there was essentially nothing left to save. He was already clinically gone. But what turned her testimony into one of the most damning moments of the entire trial wasn't the medical outcome. It was what Murray chose not to tell her. According to her account, Murray never mentioned propofol at all during the handoff, instead describing only minor doses of a sedative that had nothing to do with what had actually caused Jackson's collapse. That omission wasn't a small detail lost in the panic of an emergency. Emergency physicians make split-second decisions based entirely on the information they're given, and by withholding the one fact that mattered most, Murray effectively sent the entire resuscitation team into a fight against an enemy they couldn't see. A second physician in the trauma bay that day testified that Murray appeared frantic, begging the team not to give up, pleading with them to keep trying to save Jackson's life, and yet at the very same time, he was keeping the most critical piece of the puzzle to himself. It's a contradiction that becomes almost impossible to reconcile. A man who appeared outwardly desperate to save a life while simultaneously making choices that guaranteed the people trying to save it were working blind. Later testimony revealed something even more troubling. Once Jackson had already stopped breathing, Murray had reportedly administered yet another drug, flumazenol, apparently in an attempt to counteract the sedatives already flooding Jackson's system. Several experts who reviewed the case afterward suggested that decision may have actually worsened the situation rather than helped it. A last, desperate improvisation layered on top of everything that came before. And perhaps most damning of all was the simple matter of time. Investigators established that as much as 82 minutes passed between the moment Jackson stopped breathing and the moment anyone actually called for emergency medical help, a gap that, in a genuine medical crisis, is almost impossible to justify. When the official autopsy results came back, the chief medical examiner testified with total certainty that Jackson's death was caused by acute propofol intoxication, and he firmly rejected the defense's theory that Jackson could have injected himself, pointing out that without proper forequipment, It would have been virtually impossible for him to administer a fatal dose on his own. The cause of death was formally ruled a homicide, a word that changes the entire framing of everything that came before it. But long before Murray's phone rang with that 35-second call for help, the people closest to Michael Jackson had already been watching something break down in slow motion, and their testimony painted a picture that had almost nothing to do with drugs or medical procedure and everything to do with a man crumbling under pressure that never let up. The director hired to bring Jackson's comeback shows to life, Kenny Ortega, testified that in the days before his death, Jackson looked frail, was shivering despite warm temperatures, and seemed confused and disoriented in a way that alarmed everyone around him. Ortega, choking up on the stand, described physically rubbing Jackson's cold feet and making sure he had eaten, behaving less like a director and more like a caretaker for a man who seemed to be slipping. 5 days before Jackson died, Ortega sent an email to AEG's chief executive, describing Jackson as quite weak and fatigued and in urgent need of what he called immediate physical nurturing. It was, by any reasonable reading, a warning flare sent directly to the people producing the tour. When that concern was raised directly to Murray during an emergency meeting, called specifically to address it, the response wasn't caution, it was dismissal, an insistence that Jackson was perfectly fine according to testimony, even as the visible evidence said otherwise. One witness recalled Murray essentially telling the creative team to stay in their lane, to stop playing amateur doctor, and let him handle Jackson's health while they focused on the show. Jackson's own mother, Catherine, testified about the pressure cascading down from the concert promotion company overseeing her son's return to the stage, describing a production and rehearsal schedule that pushed her son to total exhaustion, and placing blame not just on Murray, but on an entire system that she believed had prioritized ticket sales over her son's health. Internal emails later surfaced, showing AEG executives privately worrying about Jackson's missed rehearsals and pressing Murray to get him back on track, while publicly assuring concerned staff members that Murray had been thoroughly vetted, when in fact no real background check had ever been done. Had one been conducted, it would have immediately surfaced Murray's crushing debt and the financial desperation that made him so uniquely willing to give Jackson exactly what he wanted. It's a claim that reframes the entire tragedy, suggesting that Murray wasn't operating in isolation, but was instead the final link in a much longer chain of pressure that had been building around Jackson for months, a chain that included a global concert promoter with tens of millions of dollars riding on Jackson stepping on that London stage. And then came the testimony that silenced the courtroom entirely, delivered not by a doctor or an expert, but by his own children. His son testified about the private moments no cameras ever captured, describing his father crying after phone calls with promoters and repeating a phrase that, in hindsight, feels almost prophetic, that he feared the pressure itself would be the thing that killed him. His daughter spoke about watching her father worn down by exhausting rehearsal schedules with barely any time to rest, describing a man who felt trapped by the expectations of everyone around him, unable to say no to the machine that had been built around his comeback. Listening to those two accounts side by side, a picture emerges that has almost nothing to do with pharmacology and everything to do with an exhausted, frightened man who felt he had no way out except to push through, no matter the cost to his body. The family's grief in that courtroom went far beyond sadness. It carried genuine anger, and some of it pointed in directions that went well beyond Conrad Murray himself. One of Jackson's sisters raised the possibility of a much larger and darker motive at play, suggesting that people with financial interests in Jackson's enormously valuable music publishing catalog may have had reasons of their own to want him gone, a theory that never became the legal center of the case, but that lingered in the background of the trial nonetheless. Another sister spoke for the family's collective helplessness, describing repeated attempts to address Jackson's dependency on prescription medication, attempts that ran headfirst into his intensely private nature and the tightly controlled circle of people around him, a circle that made it nearly impossible for anyone on the outside, even blood relatives, to intervene. One of his brothers put the family's regret into the starkest terms possible, stating that if they had known propofol was being used inside the house, they would have taken immediate action, legal and otherwise, to stop it. It's a devastating admission, because it means the tragedy wasn't inevitable in the eyes of the people who loved him most. It was preventable, If only the truth had reached them in time. Perhaps the most haunting testimony of all, though, came from someone outside the Jackson family entirely. Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis Presley's daughter, recalled a conversation with Jackson years before his death in which he confided a very specific fear, that he would end up dying the exact same way her own father did, from prescription drugs. It wasn't a vague anxiety. It was a precise, almost eerily accurate prediction of his own end, spoken years in advance, by a man who seemed to sense the trajectory he was on and felt powerless to change course. In November of 2011, after a trial that stretched across 6 weeks and pulled testimony from nurses, paramedics, physicians, security staff, and grieving family members, the jury reached its verdict in a matter of hours, finding Conrad Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he ultimately served less than 2 due to overcrowding and credited good behavior, a sentence that many who sat through the testimony felt was strikingly small compared to the scale of what had actually taken place inside that bedroom. But the criminal case was only the first chapter. Years later, Katherine Jackson pursued a separate civil case against AEG Live itself, arguing that the company bore responsibility for negligently hiring and failing to supervise the doctor whose paycheck they controlled. That trial pulled back the curtain even further, surfacing internal emails, financial records, and depositions that painted AEG executives as far more aware of Jackson's fragile state than they'd ever publicly admitted, even as they pushed forward with a tour that stood to generate enormous profits. Ultimately, a jury found that AEG had indeed hired Murray, but concluded the company was not liable for his conduct, a legal outcome that left many observers uneasy, since it meant no institution, only one individual doctor, was ever held formally accountable for a death that so many witnesses described as the product of an entire system working against Jackson's interests. That legal outcome, as significant as it was, never fully captured what the testimony had really exposed. This wasn't simply the story of one reckless doctor. It was the story of a man surrounded by an entire ecosystem of people, some profiting from his fame, some too frightened or too shut out to intervene, and one who was willing to give him exactly what he asked for even when he knew the risk. Jackson had been turned away by nurse after nurse, doctor after doctor, each one recognizing the danger and refusing to participate, until finally he found someone who said yes, someone whose own finances made saying no almost unthinkable. What the courtroom ultimately revealed wasn't just how Michael Jackson died, but how many chances there had been to stop it, and how each one slipped by unanswered until there were none left. His mother, his siblings, his children, all left that courtroom with a version of the same unbearable knowledge, that the warning signs had been visible for months, sometimes even voiced out loud by Jackson himself, and that somewhere between his extraordinary talent and his private desperation, the people meant to protect him simply weren't paying close enough attention, or were paying attention to the wrong things entirely. It's a story about fame at its most consuming, about trust misplaced in exactly the wrong hands, and about a man whose final words to the people around him, in hindsight, sound less like passing complaints, and more like a quiet plea for help that almost no one truly heard until it was far too late.